Actually, as we all know, in the Old Testament, the day of worship was really Saturday. And that's very obvious and that's very clear in the scripture. And according to the Old Testament accounts, they were not supposed to work on a Saturday because the obligation of resting was absolute. For example, in the book of Exodus, chapter 31, verses 14 to 16, we read, "Whoever does not keep the Shabbat but works on that day must be put to death." So the penalty for violating the no-work day was death, which is what we now call mortal sin. Because mortal means deadly. Also, in the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 21, we read, "Anyone carrying anything on the seventh day must be put to death." Or Exodus, chapter 35, verse 3, "You are not prohibited to light a fire, and anyone who lights a fire on a Shabbat must be put to death." So that's how strict the Shabbat observance was in the Old Testament. And even today, for those of you who have been to the Holy Land, that's what you will notice. On a Saturday, the really practicing Jewish people do not work on that day. That's why on that day, if you want to go to the 5th floor, 24th floor, 50th floor, you go to the Shabbat elevator. Because practicing Jews, are not allowed even to push the button of the elevator. For them, that's work already. So that's why you have to go to the Shabbat elevator. And the Shabbat elevator is the elevator you don't need to push because it will stop on every floor. Now, if you're in a hurry, don't go inside the Shabbat elevator because imagine if you're going to the 50th floor, there will be 50 stops. And that means you will arrive at the 50th floor after an hour. So you go to the non-Shabbat elevator for the pagans, for the Gentiles. And I was also told by our tourist guide that they are not allowed to light a fire. That's why there are restaurants in Tel Aviv who do not offer coffee. Because to have coffee, you need a fire. So they have to ask a pagan to do that. We cannot switch the stove. So we have to ask, you are a Catholic, okay, you can do that. Or I heard also from the tourist guide that there are restaurants whose owners would tell their workers, you can switch on the stove on a Friday evening, and you cannot switch it off so that they will not violate the Shabbat prohibition of work. That's too extreme. But anyway, because it has been prohibited. Exodus 35 verse 3, you cannot light a new fire. But if you light the fire the day before, it's okay. It's an old fire that is being kept alive. In fact, the prohibition against work on the Shabbat was so severe. In fact, we have one example here in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. Allow me to read so that you will have an idea how grave, how serious it was for the people of Israel not to violate the no-work commandment, the no-work policy, the no-work rule. I will read Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. While the Israelites were in the desert, a man was discovered gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who caught him at it brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly. But they kept him in custody, for there was no clear decision as to what should be done with him. Then the Lord said to Moses, this man shall be put to death. Let the whole community stone him outside the camp. So the whole community led him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord had commanded Moses. What was man's fault? Carrying wood, firewood. Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. That's how serious it was for the people of Israel, the no work rule on the Shabbat. But actually, even in the Old Testament, you could also see the gradual transition in preparation for the coming of the Lord. Why? Because actually, Shabbat for us Christians was not the end of the commandment. It was just a foreshadowing of what will come. What do you mean by foreshadow? It was just in anticipation, in preparation for the coming of Jesus. In other words, Shabbat alone cannot be understood without the coming of the Lord. How's that? Allow me to read a text that can hopefully explain what I mean. In the letter of Paul to the Colossians, chapter 2, verses 16 to 17, this is what we read. Let no one criticize you in matters of food or drink, or for not observing festivals, new moons, or the Shabbat. These things were only shadows of what is to come, whereas the reality is the person of Christ. Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. What is Paul telling us here? Paul is telling us, even the Shabbat should be understood from the perspective of Jesus Christ. Because Shabbat and its meaning could only be understood within the context of the life, death, and resurrection of the Lord. Because even the Shabbat of the Old Testament was only a foreshadowing, a kind of an anticipation of what's about to come. Now explicitly, or more clearly, what am I saying here? That actually, Shabbat was a celebration that should end and be, I think the right term, should be replaced by the coming of the Lord. For example, even if it's true that in the Old Testament, no, the prohibition not to work on a Saturday was very strict, there was already a transition. The rule was loosening a bit through the years. For example, in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 13, this is what we read. This is Yahweh speaking. This is God speaking. I do not need your oblations. Your incense is an abomination. New moons and Shabbats and meetings, evil with holy assemblies, I can no longer bear. So you see that even in the Old Testament, God was already becoming fed up with the Jewish festivals, and including the celebration of the Shabbat. And then in the book of Hosea, chapter 2, verse 13, God said, I will bring an end to all her gladness, her monthly feasts and Shabbats. So you see, if we have to read the Old Testament from the book of Genesis to the last book before the coming of Christ, no? The last book is the book of the prophet Malachi. There will be a transition from strict observance of the Shabbat to the loosening of the observance up to the replacement of the Shabbat by Sunday. What is my proof? While there was a loosening of the strict observance of the Shabbat, you know what? I have just read to you a few minutes ago the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. And what did we hear? A man was stoned to death for working on a Shabbat. And what was his work? For carrying firewood. Probably he was carrying firewood for his family, for his home. He might need that for warming the house or for cooking. But you know what? When Jesus came, he was violating the Shabbat. And he violated the no work rule many times. And was he punished? No. Example. John chapter 5 verses 9 to 16. Jesus met a man who was paralyzed. And the Pharisees and the scribes were observing whether he would cure that man on a Shabbat. Because they were actually expecting that Jesus would do that. And true enough, Jesus cured the man. And did they kill him? No. Did they stone him to death? No. Another, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verses 1 to 5, Jesus and his disciples picked grains of wheat and ate them, even it was on a Shabbat. That's why the Pharisees said, why are you doing that? You're not supposed to do that, picking grains and crushing them and eating. And the Lord said, you hypocrites. Don't you know the Old Testament, when Moses went into when David went into the temple and the bread that was supposed to be only for Yahweh was. So you see, there was already a transition from very strict observance of the Shabbat to the loosening up of the observance, even to the no observance of the Shabbat in the time of Jesus. So, technically speaking, it's not really correct. It's not really accurate to say that we Catholics move the observance of the Third Commandment from Saturday to Sunday. Sometimes the word that is used is we moved, no? We transferred. The correct word is replacement. There's a difference. No? You moved or replaced, because this is now the new Shabbat, Sunday. In other words, Saturday has to give way to Sunday. Why? Well, because of Jesus. As Paul said in his letter to the Colossians chapter 2, even the Shabbat was given, the no work commandment was given by Yahweh, but in preparation for the coming of Jesus Christ. And when Jesus Christ came, Sunday will now become the day of the Lord, the Lord's day. Why? Because it is the day when Christ rose from the dead. And from that moment on, the Christians would now be gathering on a Sunday, the first day of the week. We read that in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 1 to 2. John chapter 20, verses 19 to 20. John chapter 20, verses 26 to 27. Letter of Paul to the Colossians, chapter 2, verse 16. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 20, verse 7. First letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 16, verse 2. And Book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 10. There we read that the Christians will now gather to pray, to worship God, no longer on a Saturday, but on a Sunday. In the beginning, actually during the first 50 years, there were two celebrations. Those who came from Judaism, they would gather and pray on a Saturday, well, being Jews. But the Christians who were converted from paganism, the Greeks, no? The Romans who were non-Jewish people, they would gather now on a Sunday. Until finally, even the Jewish communities had to give in and follow the practice of the early Christians who came from the pagan world in observing the Third Commandment on a Sunday.